Welcome to the first of a series of online programs called Collecting Rights. Travel across the country with Gunston Hall and go behind the scenes of galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. Together, we'll discover rare objects that relate to American rights. Many of the rights we'll discuss were first codified by George Mason, who lived here at Gunston Hall. We're a historic house museum located 35 minutes outside of Washington, D.C., but we're so much more than this handsome building and the decorative art collection it contains. Visitors can choose from guided and self-guided tours, hiking trails, and a family-friendly exhibition all about the revolutionary rights originally penned by George Mason. Of course, if you live farther afield, we have lots of virtual programming to choose from. I'm Samantha Dorsey, the Curator of Collections for Gunston Hall, and I'm always working to draw connections between people, places, and things. Today, I have the great pleasure of working with Brent Tarter and the Library of Virginia to do exactly that. Hi, Brent. Can you introduce yourself? Oh, so good.
Delighted to be with you.
Good to be with you too. You're also with my dog, Theo. But I'm going to let you take the helm and introduce yourself and the Library of Virginia.
I am a retired research historian and senior editor at the Library of Virginia, where I have worked for almost 50 years studying and writing about various aspects of Virginia history. As I'm sure many of our viewers know, the Library of Virginia is the main state research library at the seat of government and also houses the archives of Virginia. More than 120 million archival records, almost all of which are unique. They preserve Virginia's history in the same way that the National Archives and the Library of Congress preserve our greater American history.
That's wonderful. So I know you and I share a healthy enthusiasm for this man, George Mason, and we've spent a lot of time thinking about, well, his big thoughts. But let's begin at the beginning. This man was born in 1725. He's the fourth of his name and a fourth generation American. For well over half his life, he thought of himself as an Englishman until he felt his rights as an Englishman were being abused and ignored. Mason and his fellow Virginians felt that British Parliament was infringing upon their rights. And after much discussion and dissatisfaction at previous attempts with working with Parliament, Mason, his neighbors, and fellow colonial lawmakers gathered in the capital of Williamsburg, Virginia, for what we call the Fifth Virginia Convention. Their intention at this gathering was to claim Virginia as an independent state and solidify their birthright as a written declaration of rights and a state constitution. Mason was staying at the Raleigh Tavern. You can see that in the image on the right. And he was the principal author of both the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the Virginia State Constitution. But Brent, can you talk to me about what the Virginia Declaration of Rights is and said, and why do you think it's such an important document?
Well, I'm delighted that you're beginning this series with the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It ranks right up there with the Declaration of Independence among the most important state papers of 1776. It was the very first document of its kind for the new nation. Other states copied or adapted portions of the Virginia Declaration of Rights for their own state bills of rights. The Declaration also influenced the Bill of Rights of the United States a decade later, and it was translated into French and influenced the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in France during the French Revolution. It established our own kind of Magna Carta, our own version of the English Bill of Rights. And in fact, there are about half a dozen provisions in the Virginia Declaration of Rights that we can trace directly to Magna Carta or the English Bill of Rights. And they have propagated themselves throughout American history. Virtually every state has a Declaration of Rights that in one way or another owes much to the Virginia Declaration of Rights, June 1776. Document of the very first order of importance.
Absolutely. I want everyone to know about it. I think it's also remarkable that you guys have this actual document at the Library of Virginia. The next slide is actually a video of the real deal. So let's look at that and talk about why we care for it in the way we do.
We have this copy that George Mason made about 1778 of his first draft for the Virginia Declaration of Rights. He was a member of the Revolutionary Convention that voted for independence, prepared and adopted the Declaration of Rights, and also prepared and adopted the first Constitution of the independent state of Virginia. This document is one of about 4 or 5 documents that enables us to trace with some detail the evolution of the Declaration of Rights from George Mason's first draft through the final adoption of the text unanimously in convention on the 12th of June, 1776. This is a copy of the first draft. The text as adopted was different in several respects. They added some parts to it, they deleted a couple of parts from it, and they reworded a few parts. And those changes teach us a great deal about how people were thinking about rights at the time of the American Revolution. It's very special that we have this copy. It's in George Mason's own handwriting, which is a very distinctive handwriting. And it's preserved here in the Library of Virginia in our special collections reading room. You can see this. Look at the handwriting on this. It's very distinctive. Nobody else from the period had a handwriting that looked exactly like this. It's very easy to read. It's very elegant. It's very careful. It's very polished. Much in the same way that George Mason's good friend George Washington's handwriting is very distinctive and bears all the same characteristics. They're quite different, but you can almost immediately recognize either of them when you see this Declaration of Rights. Now, I mentioned some changes. You will see we've highlighted a passage here. Well, we highlighted the picture of the document. We didn't draw on the original document, of course. But the highlighted passage is the opening word that all men are equally free and independent. That first statement goes on to say that all men are born with the inherent right to life, liberty, the right to acquire property, and to pursue and obtain happiness and safety. That sounds very like the Declaration of Independence, does it not? And in fact, Thomas Jefferson will have read this document before he wrote the Declaration of Independence. In both documents, they were wanting to do exactly the same thing: explain why and how they were engaged in a collective act of treason against their king, to protect, as Sam said, their former rights as Englishmen in the new American nation that they were beginning to create. Does that answer your question, Sam?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Now, I love how you pointed out close looking at the document and how regular his handwriting is, how straight his lines are. That's in part because of the wonderful linen rag paper that it is written on. There are kind of lines impregnated into it so he can follow those along. He was also a really careful, kind of calculated gentleman, and that comes through not only in his handwriting, but how he phrases what he phrases. And I so appreciate that you started with that one first line that we all carry dear in our hearts as Americans, and we see repeated time and time again. Although he does have some friends who might put it a little differently and sometimes a little more artfully. But together, man, do they make a difference and an impact on our society.
Right. This is language that embodies ideas that are at the very foundation of American history and culture. That's why I say it is the first order of importance. Right. You can see on your screen some other passages that we have highlighted too. The Declaration of Rights protected right to jury trials in civil and criminal cases. The Declaration also maintains the importance of a well-organized militia We don't have a well-organized militia anymore, but in the colonial period and in the first years of the American Republic, the militia was the first line of defense against any kind of foreign or domestic threat. Had a long history in English law and practice. The local militias were, in fact, the first line of defense against a potentially tyrannical king. So it's not surprising that this winds up in the Virginia Declaration of Rights in June of 1776. There's also a provision in there about the freedom of the press. And near the end, the last of the highlighted passages refers to the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion. That's George Mason's language. That's not the language of the convention that adopted the Declaration of Rights, because this is a place where the convention made a very, very important change. It's not clear to me whether Mason approved of the change. His language, men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion, is a repeat of a passage in the English Act of Toleration, dating all the way back to the Glorious Revolution of the 17th century. You know, at that time, the church and the state were part of each other. Everybody paid taxes to support the Church of England, in England and in Virginia. But the Act of Toleration guaranteed you the right to believe and practice differently within certain parameters and with certain limitations. But the Virginia Convention decided to go much, much farther than that and declare in favor of full religious freedom. The Declaration of Rights as adopted declares that all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. That's the first statement of its kind in the New World. Profoundly important. I think that the separation of church and state and the full free exercise of religious freedom is second only to independence among the really important contributions of the American Revolution. Yet it had this document very clearly shows how that idea was embedded in the American psyche in terms of tolerating religious dissent. But the revolution, beginning here in June 1776, transformed that toleration of difference into a celebration of religious diversity and religious freedom. That's another thing that is of the first order of importance.
One thing that I find so interesting about the Virginia Declaration of Rights is that he separates it out into different sections and he numbers them on the side. But within each section, he actually discusses multiple viewpoints. He packs a lot into this document that we spend generations unpacking and exploring on our own. I wanted to share some of those kind of universal ideas that he writes down in the next slide. For those who aren't used to reading cursive or exploring lawyer speak, because Mason was a great legal mind, although not a lawyer himself. And I just wanted to kind of touch upon some of these seminal ideas that I hope we all find of the utmost importance in our society today. Brent, did you want to?
They are repeated in the Declaration of Independence for the most part. Thomas Jefferson and George Mason knew each other. Jefferson read the draft of the Declaration of Rights about the time he started working on the Declaration of Independence. And as Sam said, these are ideas that are right at the very foundation of American culture.
Mm-hmm. I think it's just remarkable.
It is. We're very lucky.
Well, I think we're also really lucky to have this particular document, and I'd love to hear more about how it came into the Library of Virginia collection.
Well, there is a mystery of sorts. We do not know. This document has been in the state archives since before the American Civil War. I think it may have come to Richmond in 1849. George Mason's grandson, Senator James M. Mason, sent copies of some of George Mason's revolutionary letters to the Virginia Historical Society at the beginning of 1849. And one of those letters mentions this draft. We don't know who George Mason was writing. It's just, "Dear Sir." But In the middle of that letter, he described how he had worked on this document at the beginning of the American Revolution, and he boasted about it. I enclose a copy of the first draft of the Declaration of Rights, just as it was drawn by me and presented to the Virginia Convention, where it received a few alterations, some of them, I think, not for the better. George Mason had pride of authorship, and he did not like some of the changes that they made. We do not know for sure, for instance, how he felt about the change from tolerating religious dissent to celebrating religious freedom. But we do know that most of this document was his, and most of it went directly into the Declaration as adopted. I suspect that this copy may possibly have been enclosed in the letter that George Mason's grandson sent to the Virginia Historical Society in 1849. At that time, the Virginia Historical Society kept its collections of books and historic records in the Virginia State Capitol building. And it could be that somebody, somewhere along the line, took this document out of the room where the Historical Society kept its documents and put it in with other documents from the Revolutionary period as if it were an original state archival item. We don't know. That's my guess. But we have it, and we're very, very pleased to have it because it is one of the treasured items in our collection.
You take such good care of it. For those of you watching who don't know how to care for these objects, paper is really susceptible to light damage, both visible to the human eye and not visible to the human eye. So part of the discoloration you see is evidence of just how well loved and revered this object has been, because it's been on display quite a few times early in its life. And since then, as part of its perpetual care, that's our commitment to this document and our collection. It's off display quite often. So it is a rare treat to be able to discuss this with the Library of Virginia, and of course you, Brent, being such the BDR expert you are.
Well, the Declaration of Rights was, as I say, very, very important. But if you look at this image of it, you can see along the left side a white band and a narrower, very narrow white band on the right side. And we know why part of this paper is faded and part of it is not. This document was put into a picture frame and hung on the wall in Norfolk in 1907 for the 300th anniversary of the first English settlement of Virginia. The library and the archives put many of our most famous and most influential and most valuable documents on public display during that long, hot, humid summer. And during that time, the sunlight and artificial lights began to fade the paper. You can see where the picture frame was because that part did not frame. Learned a valuable lesson then. These old documents have to be taken good care of. The paper sometimes had acid residues in it. The ink could sometimes corrode the paper. So the archives in the Library of Virginia, the same as a museum with its art collection or its collection of furniture, will spend a lot of time and energy stabilizing these documents and keeping them under proper temperature and humidity controls and in the dark. And we bring out these documents and exhibit them from time to time because there's nothing so thrilling as having the opportunity to examine the original document itself. But we can't hang this on the wall for everybody to see forever because it would fade away to nothing. And then we would lose much of what is precious about this item. We have a conservation laboratory in the basement of the library here. And whenever it's important for us to put something on display, we make sure that it is properly prepared for that display so that it doesn't get further damaged.
Well, thank you for such wonderful care you take of this artifact and the vast amount of knowledge you have put into sharing this object and its big ideas with the public for so long, Brent. What a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure.
Well, I wanted to point out that, of course, this event, this series of talks will be ongoing. The next will be early in the new year, but I wanted to give the Library of Virginia a chance to talk about other things that you, our viewers, can take advantage of Barbara, did you want to join us and talk about that?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Barbara Batson, exhibitions coordinator at the library and a colleague of Brent. It's great working with Brent, and we're working with Gunston. I want to mention two programs that we have at the library. One is Making History Transcribe, and this is your chance to make history and to help everybody who does research in Virginia. Making History Transcribe is crowdsourced transcription of documents in our collection. And if you think that's not important, let me just tell you, we have a crowd that just finished the transcription of about 10,000 pages of records from the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia, which is the largest state or the largest archive of a state suffrage organization in the country. And obviously it was the basis of our current exhibition, We Demand Women's Suffrage in Virginia. What that does is to make all these documents word searchable so we can actually find things if you're working online, which we're all doing. So this is really important. It's free. You sign up and just go for it. It's a lot of fun. I wish I had more time to do it. The other thing we have is Virginia Chronicle. This is a selection of newspapers from Virginia. Not all the newspapers from Virginia, but beginning in the 19th century up through the 20th century. It's a wonderful resource, and tip of the hat and a shout out to our newspaper project folks managed by Errol Samay. This is just an incredible resource. And again, for the suffrage exhibition, we used it so much and found so much great stuff in the newspapers. We tend to forget that how important newspapers have been in our history, and this is just fabulous. So jump on to virginiachronicle.com, word search, have a blast. You have no idea what you're going to find. It's great. So those are just two things that the library offers to the public. These are free. We are your state library. So use us.
I love it. I definitely know I will take a deep dive. When I can't sleep at night, I'll help transcribe. That'll be a good use of my attention. Gunston Hall also has a number of events and opportunities that await you. We have a museum shop, which of course you can visit online, or if you'd like to come in person, we're open during our regular normal hours. I also wanted to turn your attention to another online program that we'll be hosting on December 15th in honor of Bill of Rights Day, of course, our most fullest expression of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Thank you, James Madison. We're working with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, who, working with some student leaders this summer, created their own Bill of Rights for the Bay. And we wanted to explore what they were advocating for, their thoughts behind it. And we invite you to join that conversation. Visit our website or follow us here on Facebook. We'll have lots more opportunities to talk about that in the coming weeks. And then in the new year, I wanted to plug our symposium called Dissent Made Material. It's an online serial symposium, so you can dip in and out as you so choose. This January, where we're going to explore the physical expressions of dissent in objects or physical art. Look for our formal announcement in December. I think it's going to be really exciting. If there are any last questions, we'll take them now. I'll also be following online for the rest of the day. So if you weren't able to join us live, I will respond, of course, in the days to come. So you can always leave them there. Well, Brent, I loved spending my morning with you. Thank you for your time. And thank you everyone who watched and will watch in the days and weeks to come. I hope you're well, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Sam.